She pulled a dying stranger off her front porch in the middle of a blizzard. She thought she was saving a life. She had no idea she was stepping into the center of a war that had already killed dozens of people, and that by sunrise, every killer in Chicago would know her name and her address. If this kind of story hits different for you, drop your city in the comments below and smash that like button. I want to see how far this one travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. 10. The storm hit Chicago like something that had been waiting. Not the gradual kind of winter that creeps in and lets people adjust. Not the kind that gives you a day to buy salt and move your car. This one dropped out of the sky on a Tuesday afternoon like a punishment, like the city had done something to deserve it. And by 9 o'clock that night, the wind was screaming at 42 miles an hour and the temperature had cratered to 11 below zero, and the streets outside the window of Mercy General's trauma wing looked like the surface of a dead planet. Avery Calloway had been on her feet for 16 hours. She knew because she'd stopped counting after 12. After 12 hours, counting just made it worse. It turned every minute into something you had to get through instead of something you were just living inside of. And Avery had learned a long time ago that survival in a trauma center required a certain selective blindness. You didn't look at the clock. You didn't calculate how many hours until the end of shift. You looked at the patient in front of you, and then the patient after that, and then the one after that. And you kept your head down and your hands moving. Tonight, the ER had been a war zone since 3 in the afternoon. A 20-car pileup on the I-90 had sent 17 people through their doors inside of 90 minutes. A 44-year-old construction foreman with a traumatic brain injury and a shattered pelvis. 2 teenagers from the same car who'd been thrown through the windshield because neither of them had been wearing a seatbelt. A pregnant woman 8 months along whose husband had driven them into the back of a snowplow at 40 miles an hour and walked away without a scratch while she coded twice on the table before they brought her back. Avery had been in the room for both of those codes. She'd also started 2 IVs on patients who blew every other vein, held the hand of an elderly man who'd broken his hip on an icy sidewalk, and kept asking her where his wife was. His wife who'd been dead for 11 years, whose name he kept saying like a question, and talked a 20-year-old kid out of pulling out his own IV because the pain medication wasn't working fast enough, and he'd decided in his fractured reasoning that leaving was the solution. She was not a doctor. She never wanted to be. She'd been asked that question enough times, with enough of a certain kind of condescension behind it, that specific tone that implied she'd somehow miscalculated her own ambitions, that she'd stopped trying to explain the difference. Nurses did not do less than doctors. They did different things. And in a trauma bay at 9 on a Tuesday night in a blizzard, what Avery Calloway did was keep people from falling through the cracks between all the other things happening around them. She was good at it. She hated how much it cost her to be good at it. By 10:15, the adrenaline that had been holding her vertical since early afternoon had burned down to nothing. She could feel it in the specific kind of exhaustion that lives behind the eyes. That dull, grinding pressure that doesn't go away with coffee and doesn't respond to willpower. Her feet had stopped hurting an hour ago, which she knew from experience meant the nerve endings had simply given up, and the back of her neck had developed a hard knot of muscle that she'd been stretching against all evening without making any progress. She signed her final chart, changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, and pulled her coat on in the hallway because she couldn't stand the thought of standing still inside the building for one more second. The cold hit her like a wall. She'd grown up in Chicago. She knew better than most people what February in this city actually meant. Not the glossy version on postcards with the snow-dusted lake and the skyline lit up gold, but the real version, where the wind off Lake Michigan is a physical force that gets inside your clothes and your lungs and your bones and stays there, where frostbite is a genuine medical emergency and not an abstraction, where the city empties out after dark in winter and the streets become long, whistling corridors of ice and shadow. She knew all of that. She had dressed for it. Long coat, thick scarf, boots with proper insulation. It still felt like walking into the inside of a freezer. The parking lot of Mercy General had been plowed twice since afternoon, and it already looked like it hadn't been touched. 3 inches of new snow on top of compressed ice. Her car somewhere under a white mound in the far corner of the lot. The wind dragging crystals off the snowbanks in long, horizontal streaks. A city bus that was supposed to run until midnight sat abandoned at the corner with its hazards still blinking, 2 feet of snow packed against the driver's side door. Avery found her car. She dug it out with her hands and the plastic scraper she kept under the seat, which was inadequate for the amount of ice that had formed on the windshield, but it was what she had. By the time she got the car running, she'd lost feeling in 3 fingers on her right hand, and she sat with the heat blowing directly onto her hands for 4 minutes before she felt confident enough in her grip to steer. The drive home was 4 miles. It took 37 minutes. She didn't live in a bad neighborhood. She didn't live in a great one either. That particular flavor of Chicago geography that real estate listings described as up and coming, and that the people who actually lived there described as fine, meaning the streets got plowed eventually, and the corner store was open until 10 and nobody had broken into her car in almost 8 months. She had a townhouse on a narrow street 2 blocks off a main artery, 3 stories of aging brick that she'd been renting for 4 years, that had original hardwood floors and radiators that clanged at 3 in the morning, and a view of a parking structure from the bedroom window. She loved it in a quiet, stubborn way. It was hers. That was enough. She parked on the street because the lot behind the building was buried, grabbed her bag from the passenger seat, and stepped out into wind that immediately shoved her sideways. The street was completely empty. Not just quiet empty, the way residential streets go after midnight. Actually empty, a kind of silence that cities almost never produce, where the snow muffled everything and the nearest streetlight was making that particular buzzing flicker sound that meant it was about to die. And the only movement was the curtains of snow sweeping between the buildings. Avery walked toward her front steps with her head down and her chin tucked into her scarf, watching her feet because the sidewalk was a sheet of black ice under 6 inches of fresh powder, and she'd seen enough hip fractures this week to have a vivid personal relationship with the concept of falling. She almost missed it. She was 3 feet from her steps when something wrong registered, not consciously at first, just a break in pattern, something that made the animal part of her brain slow down before the thinking part caught up. She stopped. She looked down. There was blood on the snow. Not a drop. Not a small smear. A trail. A real trail. The kind that meant something was seriously wrong with the person who had made it, dark against the white, already partially buried under the newest layer of snowfall, but still visible, still showing the irregular pattern of footsteps that had grown more staggered and farther apart as they moved toward her steps. The trail led to her front porch, and on her front porch, slumped against the railing with his legs folded at the wrong angle and his chin dropped to his chest, was a man. Avery didn't scream. She was not a person who screamed. She was a person who assessed. And what she assessed in the next 3 seconds was large male, unconscious or close to it, dressed in what had been an expensive coat, cashmere or wool blend, the kind that cost more than her monthly rent, that was now soaked through from the shoulders down with a combination of blood and snowmelt. Dark hair. One hand pressed flat against his rib cage. No visible weapon. She moved toward him before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She was halfway up the steps when his head came up. The eyes that found her face were gray. Not the soft kind of gray. Not the color people called storm or silver when they were trying to make something sound romantic. The flat, hard gray of concrete, of industrial things, of a color that wasn't trying to be anything except what it was. They were completely alert, which shouldn't have been possible given the amount of blood he'd lost. And they were aimed at her with a precision that made her stop moving. His hand came off his rib cage and locked around her wrist. The grip was wrong. It was too strong for a man who was bleeding out. The kind of grip you get from someone whose body has stopped following the rules, who is running on something past adrenaline, on pure cellular refusal to stop. No cops. His voice was low, almost conversational. No hospital. Then he was unconscious again. His hand didn't drop her wrist immediately. It relaxed in stages, the fingers going loose one at a time, and she stood on the steps for a moment with his hand still loosely circling her wrist and the snow falling around them both, and her brain performing several calculations simultaneously. She was a nurse. She had a legal and arguably moral obligation to call emergency services. She was also a nurse, which meant she could see the amount of blood saturating his coat and make a reasonable estimate about what calling emergency services and waiting for them to arrive would actually mean for him. The nearest ambulance in this storm, in this neighborhood, with the streets in the condition they were in, she pulled the math apart, and it didn't resolve into anything good. She also thought about the 2 words he'd managed to say before he lost consciousness. No cops. That phrase, delivered with that kind of controlled urgency by a man who was actively dying and had chosen to spend what might have been his last conscious words on a warning rather than a plea for help. That phrase was not the phrase of an innocent person. That was a phrase with history behind it, with specific, complicated history. None of that resolved the immediate problem, which was that there was a man dying on her front porch. Avery made a decision. She was not entirely sure it was the right one. She was entirely sure it was the one she was making. She got the door open with her keys, 3 tries because her hands were still cold and the lock was iced over. And then she went back to the man on the steps, got herself positioned underneath his arm, and started hauling. He was heavier than she'd expected, even accounting for his height and the waterlogged coat. Solid. Not the kind of lean that looks strong, the actual kind, the kind that lives in the shoulders and the back and the way a person carries their own weight. Getting him off the porch and through the door and across the hardwood of her entrance hall to the living room took 4 minutes and left her soaked with snow and breathing hard. And she had to stop twice because she lost her footing and once because he made a sound. Brief, involuntary, the sound of someone in serious pain who is trying not to make sounds. And she adjusted her grip on him. She got him onto her couch. She stepped back and looked at him for approximately 3 seconds. Then she went to work. She kept a medical kit under her bathroom sink that was significantly more serious than the standard first aid box. 4 years in emergency medicine and the specific kind of awareness that comes from seeing what happens to people when they don't have what they need had produced a kit with proper gauze, hemostatic dressing, lidocaine from a hospital supply source she preferred not to think too hard about, suture equipment, IV supplies, a blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter. She got the kit. She cut his coat off. It was destroyed anyway. And then the shirt underneath, and she did the assessment she should have done on the front steps, except she'd been dealing with other logistical problems. Gunshot wound. 1 entry point, left side, below the ribs. The exit wound was on his back, which was better than the alternative, but not as much better as people thought, because exit wounds tended to be uglier, and this one was. She packed both wounds with hemostatic gauze and applied pressure with both hands, and watched his blood pressure come up on the cuff, and told herself not to think about what she was doing right now, in terms of its implications, and just focus on the mechanics. He had other injuries. 3 cracked ribs that she could feel when she palpated, a deep laceration above his left ear that had bled heavily and then clotted, bruising across his right shoulder that suggested either a fall or an impact with a hard surface, possibly both. Someone had tried very seriously to kill this man. Based on the evidence of the wounds themselves, the precision of the entry point, the angle, it had not been an accident or a random encounter. This was targeted, professional. She worked for an hour. By the time she had him stabilized, wounds packed and dressed, IV in his arm, fluids running, blood pressure at something she was no longer immediately terrified by, she was shaking slightly from sustained adrenaline, and her back ached from bending over the couch at that angle. She washed her hands in the kitchen sink and stood there for a moment with the water running over her wrists, and looked out the window at the snow still coming down. Then she went back to the living room and started looking for identification. His coat was ruined beyond any usefulness, and the shirt she'd cut off him had no pockets. But his pants had a slim wallet in the interior pocket. Not a regular bifold, but something custom, dark leather, no visible branding. And inside the wallet was a driver's license that said his name was Cassian Voss, 41 years old, with a Gold Coast address. No credit cards, no insurance card, no receipts, no business cards, nothing that most people accumulated in their wallets over time through ordinary living. Just the license, a folded piece of paper with a handwritten address that meant nothing to her, and $6,000 in cash. $6,000 in cash. She stared at the bills for a moment. Hundreds, 50s, the kind of money that said either he'd just come from a bank or he carried this amount as a matter of course, neither of which was a reassuring interpretation, and put the wallet back where she'd found it. She went to the kitchen and made coffee because she wasn't going to sleep regardless, and she needed something to do with her hands while she thought. The name Cassian Voss. She knew that name. She didn't know where from at first. It was not the kind of name that appeared in ordinary conversation. Not the name of anyone she'd treated or worked with or lived near. It lived in a different register. She turned it over while the coffee brewed, and it came to her slowly, the way things come to you when you've heard them in passing, through other people's mouths, through the particular kind of hospital gossip that involved police officers who sometimes came through the ER and talked when they thought no one was paying attention. Voss. There was a Voss syndicate. She'd heard that phrase. She'd heard it from a detective named Reardon, who'd come in twice last year with various colleagues, once with a gunshot victim of his own, and once because he'd been slightly stabbed in a situation he'd described only as a disagreement, and he'd mentioned the Voss organization in passing. The way cops mentioned weather, as a condition of the environment, something that was simply there, something that shaped the landscape of the city without requiring explanation. She set her coffee down on the counter and went back to the living room. The man, Cassian Voss, was still unconscious, but his color was better, his breathing was steadier, and the monitors she had him attached to were telling her he'd moved out of the immediate danger zone into a different zone that was merely critical rather than immediately life-threatening. She pulled the blanket she'd draped over him aside to check the dressing on his side wound, and that was when she saw the tattoo. Inside his left forearm, partially obscured by the edge of the IV tape, a design she'd seen before, or something close enough that her brain treated it as a match. Two intersecting lines inside a geometric border, clean and precise in the way of a professional tattoo, the kind of design that meant something specific to the person who wore it. She had seen that design in a photograph once. She'd seen it in a stack of papers spread across a break room table, materials that belonged to the detective Reardon who'd left them unattended for 10 minutes. And she hadn't been trying to read them, but she'd registered the image the way the brain registers images even when you're not looking for them. The Voss Syndicate. She sat down in the armchair across from her couch. She sat there for a long time. The man she'd dragged out of the snow and spent an hour stabilizing and hooked up to her IV and covered with her blanket was not a victim of circumstance. He was not a regular person who'd gotten caught in something. He was the kind of person other people got caught in. She thought about the $6,000 in his wallet. She thought about the precision of the wound. She thought about the professional quality of the coat she'd cut off him, the custom wallet, the way he'd said those two words, "no cops," with that specific calibration of authority, like a person who was accustomed to having his instructions followed even when he was at significant disadvantage. She thought about getting up and calling 911. She didn't move. The coffee went cold on the kitchen counter. The storm kept throwing itself at the windows. The radiators clanged and hissed in the way they always did, comforting in their ordinary brokenness, and Avery sat across from the man she'd saved and tried to figure out what she had actually done. Around 3 in the morning, he woke up. She heard it before she saw it, a change in his breathing, the small shift of someone moving toward consciousness, and she was out of the armchair and standing beside the couch before she'd consciously registered moving. His eyes opened the same way they'd found her on the porch, directly, without the usual disorientation of a person waking in an unfamiliar place. He looked at the ceiling, then the room, then her, and none of those assessments took more than a second each. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough, abraded by pain or dehydration or both. "It's my house." Avery kept her own voice flat. "How do you feel?" "Like someone shot me." "Because someone shot you, through and through, below the ribs. You lost a significant amount of blood. The good news is nothing vital appears to have been hit. The bad news is you need more care than I can give you here." He looked at the IV in his arm, then at the dressings visible above the blanket line, then at the pulse oximeter on his finger. Something moved through his expression, not gratitude exactly, more like recalibration, like a man adjusting his understanding of a situation. "You're medical. Nurse, ER. She paused. "Who shot you?" "That's not something you want to know." "I already know your name. Cassian Voss." She watched his face carefully when she said it, watched for the tell that would tell her how seriously to take the next few seconds. What she got was stillness, absolute, practiced, the stillness of someone who had been surprised before and had learned to make surprise invisible. "I recognized the tattoo." A long moment. "How long has it been?" "Since you were conscious? About 5 hours. It's close to 3 in the morning." She folded her arms across her chest, not aggressively, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "You're in my living room. You passed out on my front porch." "I know where I was." He shifted, tried to push himself upright, and the sound he made was brief and involuntary, and she could see from the set of his jaw that he despised having made it. I was looking for somewhere to stop. You were looking for somewhere to bleed out. I was buying time. His eyes went to the window, where the storm was still visually present even in darkness. The quality of the light outside, the sound. The storm. Still going. If anything, it's worse. Good. She looked at him. Good? It slows everyone down equally. He tried to sit up again, more carefully this time, and made it about halfway before something in his expression shifted, and he stopped. The IV. Can it come out? Absolutely not. I need to make a call. You can make a call lying down. He looked at her with those flat gray eyes, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, You should have called the police. Yes. Why didn't you? She thought about it. Not the answer she'd give him, but the actual answer, the one she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. Because you said not to. Something shifted in his face. Just barely. That's not enough of a reason. I know. You don't know what I am. I have a reasonable idea. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped further, as if conserving something. There are people looking for me. When they find where I stopped, how would they find your address? I don't mean my address. He met her eyes. I mean this building, this street. Avery understood what he was saying. She understood it completely and immediately, and the understanding moved through her body as a physical sensation, cold, spreading, starting in her chest. You were tracked here. Not yet. Maybe. He held her gaze and didn't soften what came next. But eventually, she moved to the window. The street outside was still buried in snow, still empty, still displaying that false peacefulness that blizzards produce when they've consumed everything and the only movement is the storm itself. But she was looking at it differently now, looking at the parked cars with their outlines blurred by accumulated snow and trying to remember which ones had been there when she pulled up and which had appeared afterward, and realizing she had no idea because she'd been looking at the ground when she walked in. My name is Avery Calloway. I know. She turned from the window. How do you know that? Your hospital ID is on the table. He nodded toward it. She'd taken it off when she changed out of her coat and put it down without thinking. ER nurse. Mercy General. She looked at the ID and then at him and felt something that wasn't quite fear, more like the specific feeling of understanding that a situation is larger than you initially assessed it. There's coffee in the kitchen, she said. I'll heat it up, and then you're going to tell me what's actually happening. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between assessment and something else, something older and less tactical. Sit down, he said. I'll tell you. The coffee was still warm enough. She stood in the kitchen and heated it properly and carried 2 cups back to the living room, which was either the most normal thing she'd done in the last several hours or the most insane thing she'd ever done in her life. And the answer was probably both. She sat in the armchair. He pulled himself into something closer to upright, moving with the careful economy of a man who knows exactly where his broken pieces are and is navigating around them, and he wrapped both hands around the coffee cup without drinking from it, like the warmth was the thing he needed. My brother's name is Lucien, he said. Younger by 4 years. Okay. 3 weeks ago, he made an arrangement with a private military contractor operating in the Great Lakes region. The arrangement involved personnel and firepower. Tonight, those personnel were at the shipping district at Calumet Harbor. He paused. I barely made it out. She did the math. The harbor was roughly 14 miles from her street. 14 miles in a blizzard on foot. The amount of blood he'd lost, the temperature outside, the condition he'd been in when he showed up on her porch. You drove? Stole a car, left it 6 blocks from here when I couldn't see the road anymore. How long were you in the snow before you found my porch? I don't know. I stopped tracking time. She thought about that, about what it meant to stop tracking time when you're bleeding out in a blizzard at 11 below zero, and your brother has just tried to have you killed. She kept her voice even. What do you need? He looked at her directly. My organization has a security detail. I need to contact them. You said that already. I said you can do that lying down. I need them here. How many people are in this security detail? Something moved through his expression that might have been appreciation if it had come from someone with a less carefully controlled face. Enough. That's not an answer. More than 5, he said. It won't be a quiet arrival. She thought about her street, her quiet, up-and-coming, nobody's broken into my car in 8 months street. She thought about her neighbors. The retired teacher on the left, the family with 3 kids on the right, the building across the way with the good gutters and the always lit window on the 3rd floor. Call them, she said. He reached into the pocket of the pants she hadn't cut off him and produced a phone. He looked at it for a moment. It had a cracked screen and what appeared to be dried blood on the casing, and dialed from memory. The call lasted 45 seconds. He spoke in what she identified as a mix of English and something else, not a language she recognized, something clipped and irregular, a hybrid, possibly deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He gave what seemed to be coordinates. He ended the call. 40 minutes, he said, given the roads. And in 40 minutes there are going to be armed people in your living room, yes. She stood up. She walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter and pressed her palms flat against the cold tile and breathed for a moment. Not the controlled professional breathing she used during difficult cases. Not the deliberate calm of someone managing a crisis. Just breathing, the basic animal function, because the alternative was something she couldn't afford right now. Then she went back to the living room. I need you to tell me what's on that drive. He looked at her. You have an encrypted drive, she said. Or you had one. That's why he tried to kill you tonight specifically, isn't it? Not a power struggle in the abstract. Something you took, something you have, something that becomes a problem for him if you survive. The silence stretched. You're perceptive, he said. I'm exhausted, and I have a dying man on my couch, and there are going to be armed strangers in my house in 40 minutes. I don't have the patience for deflection. His jaw moved slightly. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not softer, but stripped of the particular layer of performance that she'd noticed was present in the way he talked. The professional calibration of a man who is accustomed to controlling what he communicated. Financial records. Internal records going back 6 years. Transactions, payments, contracts, names. Names connected to what? To things that would end careers, possibly end freedom. He paused. Lucien expanded the operation in directions I refused. He made partnerships I wouldn't have sanctioned. When I found out, I copied what I could. Where's the drive now? Somewhere secure. But he thinks you have it on you. He thinks I have it on me, or that I'm the only one who knows where it is. Yes. She thought about this. She thought about the precision of the wound, below the ribs, an angle that suggested someone who wanted him incapacitated rather than immediately dead, someone who wanted answers before the final step. They weren't trying to kill you quickly, she said. No. They wanted to take you alive. I didn't cooperate. He said it simply, without any particular drama. Just a fact. Just a thing that had happened. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she hadn't fully let herself since she'd been in assessment mode, in clinical mode, in the managed emergency of keeping him alive. 41 years old, according to the license, which matched the lines on his face. The specific kind of aging that happens to people who carry significant weight for significant time. Not old, not soft. There was nothing soft about this person. But there was something in the set of his mouth, in the eyes when the professional control momentarily relaxed, that was different from what she'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something more monolithic, maybe. Something more simply villainous. What she had was a man drinking her coffee with cracked ribs and a gunshot wound who was apologizing for an armed convoy about to arrive in her driveway with the specific economy of someone who almost never said sorry for anything. The first headlights appeared at the end of her street 22 minutes later, not 40, which meant either the roads were better than expected or they'd been moving before he called. He saw her expression. They were already looking, he said. I told them to narrow the area. You knew roughly where you were going to end up. I knew the neighborhood. I didn't know the address. 3 black vehicles came down the street in tight formation, moving with the careful control of drivers who knew what they were doing in snow. They stopped in front of her building with an efficiency that was itself a statement. Not frantic, not loud, just precise. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. An unknown number. She answered. Ms. Calloway. A woman's voice, low and professional. "My name is Sable. I work for Cassian Voss. We need to discuss the next few minutes." Avery looked across the room at the man on her couch. "Go ahead," she said. "Before we enter, I need you to understand something. 14 minutes ago, we identified a surveillance drone operating over the block adjacent to yours. It is consistent with the equipment used by Lucien Voss's contractor unit." A pause. "We believe your location has been compromised. How quickly can you be ready to move?" She heard the words. She processed them with the same clinical clarity she used when a patient's condition changed faster than expected, when the board wiped clean and a new set of priorities appeared. She looked around her living room, the coffee cups, the cut-up coat on the floor, the blood on her couch that she already knew was never coming out. 5 minutes, she said. 3 would be better. 3, she said. She ended the call. Cassian Voss was watching her from the couch, with those gray eyes, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that she didn't have a word for yet. The particular understanding of two people who have just passed the point where turning back is an available option. "I'm going to need a bag," she said. "Take what matters. I'm going to need you to stand up and walk to the door." "I can do that." "Without passing out." "That one," he said slowly, "is less certain." Outside, engines were running. Lights were cutting through the blizzard. And somewhere 4 blocks away, a drone was transmitting her address to people who had tried once tonight to take a man alive and failed, which meant they were going to try harder the next time. And she was now standing in the room where he'd last been. Avery went upstairs to pack a bag. She had no idea where she was going. She had no idea how long she'd be gone. She had no idea as she pulled a bag from her closet and started choosing what to take from a life she'd spent years carefully building, that the quiet, exhausting, irreplaceable life she was packing away in 3 minutes would never be fully hers again, that the stranger she'd dragged in from the snow had not been the end of something dangerous arriving at her door. He had been the beginning. She zipped the bag. She went downstairs. Cassian Voss was on his feet, barely, one hand braced against the wall, his face stripped down to something rawer than strategy. The door opened, and the night swallowed them whole. The vehicle was a blacked-out Suburban with reinforced doors and tinted glass so dark it turned the world outside into a smear of moving shadow, and Avery sat in the middle seat with her bag between her feet and her shoulder pressed against the cold window and tried to count her own breaths. 4 in the vehicle with her. Driver. A man who hadn't given his name and hadn't been asked for it. Broad across the back, military short hair, hands on the wheel with the stillness of someone who'd driven in worse conditions than this and considered it unremarkable. Front passenger, a woman who'd introduced herself only as Sable on the phone and in person turned out to be exactly what her voice had suggested. Late 30s, angular face, a quality of attention that swept a room the way a scanner sweeps a document, taking everything in and registering it without visible reaction. And 2 more in the back, behind Avery, whose name she didn't know, and whose presence she felt as a specific kind of pressure between her shoulder blades. Cassian Voss was in the vehicle ahead of hers. That had been Sable's arrangement, and Avery had understood the logic without being told. Separate him from her, keep the primary asset contained, treat the nurse as a secondary variable that required management rather than protection. She had not protested the arrangement. She wasn't sure she had the standing to protest anything right now. She watched her street disappear through the back window. There was a light on in the 3rd floor of the building across from hers, the always lit window, the one she'd looked at for 4 years without knowing who was behind it. It was still on as the convoy pulled away, steady and orange and ordinary, and she watched it until the corner took it out of sight, and then there was nothing to watch except the storm. The blizzard had not eased. If anything, the visibility was worse than it had been when she'd driven home. The wind had picked up again and was throwing sheets of snow horizontally across the headlights, and the streets they moved through had the abandoned quality of a city that had simply decided to wait the weather out and deal with whatever was left afterward. No other cars, no pedestrians, just the 3 vehicles moving in formation through the whiteout, and the particular silence of a car full of people who are all thinking harder than they are speaking. Sable turned from the front seat. "You're a trauma nurse," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." 4 years at Mercy General. Before that, Cook County. Avery looked at her. You ran my name in the last 20 minutes. I ran your name when Cassian called. Standard protocol. Sable's voice carried no apology for this. No criminal record, no financial irregularities, one dismissed traffic citation from 3 years ago. The light was yellow. They usually are. Sable held her gaze with that flat, comprehensive attention. You have no connection to the organization. Correct. No connection to any affiliated organization. Also correct. So when you saw the tattoo, you stayed anyway. Avery turned back to the window. I was already in it. He was on my couch. People extract themselves from situations like that all the time. Call the police. Tell them you found him outside. Step back. You chose not to. Are you asking me why, or are you telling me you already know why? Something shifted in Sable's expression. The faintest recalibration. The kind that comes from having a person perform slightly differently than the model you built for them. I'm establishing what you understand about your current position. I understand my current position fine, Avery kept her voice level. I treated a gunshot wound without reporting it. I assisted in the departure of a person of interest from a potential crime scene. I am currently in a vehicle with armed individuals whose legal status I'm choosing not to examine too carefully. My position is complicated. Yes. And I'm guessing you're about to tell me that making it uncomplicated by going back is no longer an option. The drone that was surveilling your block transmitted approximately 4 minutes of footage before we jammed the signal. In that footage, you are visible assisting Cassian into the vehicle. Sable let that settle. Lucien's people now have your face, your address, your employer. The words landed with a specific physical weight. Avery felt it in her stomach. Not panic, which was a hot feeling, but something colder and heavier. The particular sensation of a door closing. So I can't go back. Not tonight. And tomorrow? Sable's silence was its own answer. They drove for another 20 minutes without speaking. The city thinned around them, the density of buildings giving way to wider streets. The kind of industrial geography that exists at the edges of major cities, warehouses and freight yards and long, featureless structures whose purpose wasn't advertised. Eventually, they turned through a gate that opened as they approached and closed immediately behind the convoy, and the vehicles pulled into a covered structure that smelled of concrete and machine oil, and the particular cold of a large space that was heated only enough to keep equipment from freezing. Avery got out. The structure was a converted freight depot. She could see the bones of what it had been in the ceiling height and the loading dock doors along the far wall. Now it held vehicles, equipment she didn't look at too carefully, and a cluster of people who moved with the coordinated purposefulness of a security operation that had been running on high alert for hours. Cassian was already out of the lead vehicle. He was standing against the side of the Suburban with his jaw set and his hand pressed against his ribs in the way she recognized. Not clutching, not demonstrating pain, just applying counterpressure, the way a person does when they're managing discomfort through awareness rather than medication. He was upright, and he was doing it under his own power, which meant he was exceeding what she'd have predicted for someone in his condition, which told her something about what he was running on. He looked at her across the space, and something passed between them. Not warm, not the kind of thing you'd call relief, but mutual acknowledgement. They had both made it to the next step. Then a man appeared from the far side of the lead vehicle, and the entire quality of the air in the space changed. He was younger than Cassian by the 4 years she'd been told, and the difference was visible, not just in age, but in something less quantifiable, the specific restlessness of someone who had always moved faster than the pace set for him. Dark hair, same jaw structure as Cassian, same height, but less consolidated somehow, as if the same materials had been assembled with slightly different priorities. He was dressed well in the way of someone who cared about being dressed well, and he was angry in the way of someone who had been frightened and was converting it as fast as possible. But this wasn't Lucy. Avery understood that within seconds. This was someone whose anger was pointed at Cassian with the specific quality of loyalty. Not a rival's fury, but a lieutenant's. The rage of someone who had been kept out of something they believed they had the right to know. 12 hours, the man said. He stopped 6 feet from Cassian. You've been dark for 12 hours. We found the car. We found the blood on the road. We had people on the ground at Calumet for 9 hours before we... Declan. Cassian's voice was quiet. Don't. Declan's voice cut across him, and it was raw in a way that surprised Avery. Genuinely raw. not performed. Don't do the voice. I've been pulling bodies out of the harbor all night trying to figure out if one of them was you. A silence. I'm alive, Cassian said. Obviously. Declan's jaw was working. He was somewhere between 28 and 32, Avery estimated, and he was fighting to hold something together in his face that badly wanted to come apart. 37 people, Cassian. 37 from our side. 8 of them I've known since I was a kid. He stopped, swallowed. He had people on the inside. 2 of them were with us for 3 years. I know. How long did you know about the inside people? The question hit the space like something thrown. Cassian didn't flinch, but Avery saw the thing in his expression. The slight tightening, the fractional pause before answer. I had suspicions, not certainties. Suspicions. Declan repeated the word slowly, like he was examining it from every angle and finding it insufficient from all of them. 37 people. Yes. And the suspicions didn't feel like something worth mentioning. If I'd moved on suspicion and been wrong, I'd have purged loyalists and handed Lucian the internal chaos he needed to move without resistance. Cassian held his ground. His voice stayed even. It was a calculation. It was a bad one. Yes. And that came out differently. No performance to it, no justification layered underneath. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who knew the weight of what he was carrying. It was. Declan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Avery with the particular expression of someone noticing something they'd been too agitated to register. Who is this? Her name is Avery Calloway. She's the reason I'm standing here. Declan looked at her. Really looked. The kind of assessment that strips context away and tries to see what's actually present. She stood still for it because there was nothing else to do. Nurse, he said after a moment. Hands. She almost asked what he meant, then understood. He'd seen the way she was standing, the way her hands were positioned, some echo of clinical habit in her posture. Trauma nurse, yes. You pulled that bullet? Through and through. I packed and dressed it. In what conditions? My living room, medical kit from under my bathroom sink. Something moved in his expression. Not warmth, something more grudging than warmth, the specific reluctant respect of someone recalibrating. He turned back to Cassian. We need to move you to the secure medical facility. Your ribs, after the briefing. The briefing can wait until... The briefing, Cassian said, cannot wait. Declan looked at him for a long moment with that raw, barely contained energy. Then he turned and walked toward the interior of the depot without another word. Cassian followed him. Avery stood for a moment beside the Suburban with Sable a few feet away, watching the 2 men walk into the lit interior of the space, and she thought about what she'd just witnessed. Not the argument itself, but the specific texture of it, what it revealed about the man she'd pulled off her porch. The calculation he'd described. The acknowledgement of failure that had come without evasion. She didn't know what to do with it yet. There's a room where you can wait, Sable said. I'd rather hear the briefing. Sable looked at her. I'm in this, Avery said. Completely and not by choice. I'd rather know what I'm in than wait in a room while other people decide things about my situation. Another one of those fractional recalibrations. Then Sable nodded once, briefly, and walked toward the interior. Avery followed. The briefing room was a converted office, metal desk and folding chairs, and a monitor showing a map of Chicago's South Side with various points marked in red. And there were 4 other people in it besides Cassian and Declan, faces she didn't know, people who looked at her when she came in with the controlled neutrality of trained professionals assessing an anomaly. She sat against the wall, out of the way. She was not invited to sit there. She also wasn't told not to. Declan drove the briefing with the kinetic efficiency of someone who processed information by moving through it quickly. The attack at Calumet Harbor had involved 46 hostile personnel. The Voss organization's security presence at the harbor had been 31 people. Of those, 22 were confirmed dead, 6 unaccounted for, 3 in custody at a secure location with injuries. The 2 identified inside operatives had been removed from the field. Declan's phrasing was spare about what that meant, and Avery chose not to press it internally. Lucian had not been present at the harbor. He had directed the operation remotely. Where is he now? Cassian asked. The Gold Coast property went dark 4 hours ago. We have 3 possible secondaries. Declan tapped the map. Here, here, and here. Confidence on the first is 60%, the others lower. And the contractor unit? Restructuring after the engagement. They took losses too. We estimate 12 to 18 hours before they're operational again at full capacity. Declan paused. That's the window. It's not enough time. It's what we have. Cassian was looking at the map with an expression that Avery had started to recognize. The specific inward quality of someone running through scenarios, costs, outcomes, rejecting and accepting in rapid internal sequence. What's the status of the drive? Secure. Kenji has it at the secondary location. Lucien doesn't know about Kenji. As far as we can determine. As far as we can determine, Cassian repeated, and the echo was deliberate. He was flagging the qualifier, holding it up to the light, because inside operations had already cost 37 people tonight, and qualified certainty was not the same as certainty. Who else knew about the drive's existence? Silence in the room. Avery watched the faces. One of the 4 people she didn't know shifted weight from one foot to the other, barely, fractional, and she noted it the way she noted small changes in patients, not as a conclusion but as data. 3 people in this organization knew about the drive, Cassian said. He said it carefully. Declan, Sable, and a third person whose name I'm not going to say in this room right now. He looked at Declan. Lucien's people tracked me to Avery's neighborhood 4 hours after the attack. That's too fast for a surveillance drone to account for. They were already narrowing the search radius before the drone went up. Declan had gone very still. I'm not accusing anyone in this room, Cassian said. I'm saying the information about the drive, specifically its location at the secondary site, needs to be treated as potentially compromised until I can assess the situation personally. That means the drive is exposed, Declan said. Possibly. Then Kenji. I'll reach Kenji through a channel that hasn't been used in this operation. Tonight. Cassian turned to Sable. The Wyoming property. Is it still clean? Last verification was 48 hours ago. Verify again. If it clears, we move there at first light. He looked at the map one more time and then looked at Avery. She met his gaze from across the room. She hadn't meant to make it a moment. It just became one. The two of them looking at each other across a room full of armed, calculating people, in the middle of a disaster she'd been dragged into through the specific accident of her porch, and something moved in his expression that she didn't entirely know how to interpret. Not apology. Not exactly. Something more complicated than apology. Something that acknowledged cost without pretending the cost could be undone. She looked away first. An hour later, she was in a room that someone had set up with a cot and a blanket and a bottle of water, and she lay on the cot in her clothes and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. She thought about the man who had shifted his weight. She thought about 37 dead people she didn't know. She thought about Sable's flat voice saying the drone had transmitted her face, and Lucien Drisi. And Voss's people now knew who she was. She thought about the Trauma Foundation director who was supposed to be reviewing her scheduling request next week. About the plants on her windowsill that nobody was going to water. Around 5 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door. Not approaching, just passing, the specific cadence of someone doing a security walk, methodical and measured. She listened to them fade, and then she lay in the returned silence and thought about what it cost to survive. At 6:15, someone knocked. She was already sitting up. "Come in." It was Cassian. He looked worse in the industrial lighting than he had in the dimmer warmth of her living room. The pallor more visible, the effort of being upright more honestly registered on his face. He was dressed in fresh clothes someone had provided, dark and practical, and he'd put on a coat that was a step down from the ruined cashmere but still expensive. He was moving carefully, the ribs governing every shift of his weight. He stood in the doorway. "We leave in 40 minutes. "Okay." He didn't leave. She looked at him. "What?" "You should be angry," he said. "I am angry." "You're being very controlled about it." "I work in emergency medicine. I'm always angry about something, and I'm usually controlled about it." She held his gaze. "Why are you here?" "You could have sent Sable." He came into the room. He leaned against the wall because standing without support was costing him something he was running low on. "I'm going to be straightforward with you. Please. You have no obligation to continue. We can arrange documentation, a new identity, placement in a city where Lucien's reach is limited. You'd be safe. You'd be separate from this. She studied him. But the footage exists. His people have your face and your employer. A new identity is protection against a manhunt, not against an organization that will look for you specifically because of what you know about where I was. So the offer isn't real. The offer is real. The safety guarantee is limited. She pressed her hands flat on the cot, feeling the rough fabric of the blanket. What's the other option? Stay close until this resolves. Your skill set is genuinely useful. He paused. And you'd be harder to get to. So my options are limited protection far away or moderate protection close to the thing that wants to kill you. Yes, she looked at the wall. You're not very good at making people feel good about their situations. I've been told. She stood up. She picked up her bag. What time does the flight leave? Something in his jaw released. Barely, but she was watching carefully enough to see it. We drive to the airstrip at 6:50. I need coffee first. There's coffee. Real coffee or the kind that tastes like hot water's been in the same room as coffee grounds? Something that was almost not quite a smile moved across his face and disappeared. I'll find out. He turned to leave. Cassian, she said it before she'd decided to say it, and he stopped, half-turned in the doorway with that careful management of his injured side. The person in the briefing room who moved when you mentioned the drive. The one who shifted their weight. She watched his face. You saw it too. He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. Do you know who it is? I have a suspicion. And then, with the faintest edge of something bleak underneath the control, I've been wrong about suspicions before. He left. She stood in the empty room with her bag and the remaining 40 minutes before departure, and the very specific feeling of a person who has passed through several successive doors and turned around to find each one locked behind her. The drive to the airstrip was 40 minutes through the gray Chicago dawn. The storm finally quieted into the heavy, exhausted stillness that follows major weather. The city covered in 3 feet of new snow that muffled sound and softened edges and made everything look deceptively peaceful. The airstrip was private, the kind that didn't appear on public databases, the kind that existed to service the kind of travel that didn't want documentation. A small jet sat on the cleared runway with its stairs down, engines already running. Avery was halfway up the stairs when Declan appeared at her shoulder. A word. She stopped. The wind at the top of the stairs was bitter and direct. Go ahead. Declan's face was different than it had been in the depot. The rawness was still there, but it had compressed, gotten denser. He kept his voice low. You made an impression on him. I don't know what happened in your living room between the time you found him and the time we arrived, but whatever it was, I kept him alive. That's all. That's not what I mean. Declan looked at her steadily. He doesn't tell people things. About the operation, about the internal mechanics, about what he's thinking. He doesn't. He paused. He told you about the drive. In the briefing, he looked at you like, Don't, she said. Declan stopped. I don't know what you're worried about, she said, but if what you're about to say is that I'm a liability because he trusts me too quickly, say that. If you're about to say something else, don't. A beat. Then Declan exhaled slowly through his nose. Be careful with him, he said. Not because he's dangerous, because He stopped, visibly pulling something back. Just be careful. He went past her up the stairs. She stood on the step for a moment in the cold with the jet engine noise washing over everything and the flat gray Wyoming-bound sky above, and thought about what Declan had stopped himself from saying. She boarded the plane. She found her seat and buckled in and looked out the window at the runway as the jet began to move, and she thought, 12 hours ago I was finishing a double shift and dreaming about sleep. The wheels left the ground. And then Sable was moving quickly up the aisle with a phone in her hand and an expression that Avery had not seen on her face before. Something beneath the professional surface, something that was not quite controlled. She stopped at Cassian's seat. Kenji, she said. The name alone was enough to make Cassian go completely still. They found the secondary location. Sable's voice was low, precise, and she was clearly working to keep it both of those things. 40 minutes ago, Kenji is... She stopped. Kenji is gone. And the drive was gone. Cassian's face did something complicated and then went entirely still, and the stillness was worse than whatever the something complicated had been. Without the drive, there was no evidence. Without the evidence, there was no case. Without the case, there was nothing standing between Lucian Voss and complete control of an organization that had just demonstrated it could. The words hung in the recycled air of the cabin like smoke that wouldn't clear. Sable said them again, quieter, as if volume had been the problem the first time. The drive is gone. Cassian didn't move. He was sitting with both hands flat on the armrests and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Sable's shoulder, and the stillness he'd gone into wasn't the controlled professional stillness Avery had catalogued over the last several hours. It was something different. The stillness of a man whose internal architecture had just taken a hit in a load-bearing place. Avery watched him from 2 rows back. She watched him come back from wherever he'd gone, not fast, not with any pretense that it had been quick. And when he looked up at Sable, his face had done the work of reassembling itself into something operational, but the effort of that reassembly was visible in a way it hadn't been before. "Kenji?" he said, just the name. The question inside it was clear enough. Sable's jaw moved once. "We don't have confirmation of status. The location was burned. Our contact in the area says the structure is gone. Accelerant fire, which means it was deliberate and fast. Nobody was found inside." "Nobody was found inside," Cassian repeated, "which means either Kenji moved before they arrived or they moved the body." He said it without inflection, without the softening that most people apply to that particular sentence. Just the fact, laid flat. "How long between my call to Kenji and the time the location went dark?" "Approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes. Avery did the math without meaning to. The briefing in the depot, the departure preparation, the drive to the airstrip. 90 minutes was a tight window. Tight enough to mean that whoever had moved on the secondary location had been ready to move before Cassian's call to Kenji had even gone through. They hadn't been responding to the call. They'd already known. She saw the same calculation move through Cassian's face and resolve into the same place it had resolved in hers. Declan was standing at the front of the cabin. He had his back to the cockpit door and his arms crossed, and he was very carefully not looking at anyone in particular, which was its own kind of looking. "The call to Kenji," Cassian said. He was still speaking to Sable, but his eyes had moved. "What channel?" "The secondary protocol. The one that—" Sable stopped. She turned her head slightly, following the direction of Cassian's gaze. "The one that 3 people in the organization knew about," Cassian said. The cabin went quiet in the specific way of a small space where everyone has stopped pretending they're not listening. Declan unfolded his arms. "Don't. I'm not accusing you. You're looking at me. I'm looking at the front of the cabin because that's where you're standing." Cassian's voice was flat and careful and entirely without heat, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "The secondary protocol channel. Who accessed it in the last 24 hours? I need that log." "I can pull it," Sable said. "Pull it now." She moved to the back of the cabin with her phone. Declan stayed at the front. The jet was climbing, the ground falling away through the windows into the white expanse of the storm's aftermath. And Avery sat in her seat and felt the pressure of the altitude change in her ears and watched the space between the 2 men with the specific attention of someone who had learned to read a room from the particular angle of human damage. It took Sable 4 minutes. She came back up the aisle and stood beside Cassian and showed him the phone screen. He looked at it for a long time. His face did not change. Then he looked up at the front of the cabin. "Declan," he said, "come here." Declan walked down the aisle with the controlled stride of a man walking toward something he's already decided he's going to walk toward. He stopped beside Cassian's seat. Cassian held the phone up so he could see the screen. Declan looked at it. Something happened in his face. Not guilt, not the collapse of a person caught. Something more complicated and in some ways worse. Recognition. The specific recognition of a person seeing something they already knew was coming. "That's not what it looks like," he said. "Tell me what it looks like." "It looks like I accessed the secondary channel at 2:14 this morning." Declan's voice was tight, compressed. "I did access it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't." "Why?" "Because I was trying to reach Kenji myself. Before you did. Before the briefing." He held Cassian's gaze and didn't blink and didn't shift his weight this time, stood completely still in a way that was its own kind of statement. I found out about the drive 3 weeks ago. Not from you. I found out because Kenji told me. Because Kenji was scared and needed someone to talk to, and I was the person he called. The silence in the cabin had gone very dense. You knew about the drive, Cassian said. Yes. For 3 weeks. Yes. And you didn't tell me you knew. Declan's jaw worked. I was waiting to see if you'd tell me yourself. He stopped. Something cracked open briefly in his expression and then sealed again. You didn't. You kept it from me the same way you kept the suspicions about the inside operatives, the same way you keep everything. Calculated, controlled, alone. So yes, I went around you. I reached out to Kenji directly to make sure he knew to move if things went wrong at the harbor. His voice had developed an edge that was not anger exactly, but the thing that precedes anger, when anger has been running underneath for a long time. Things went wrong at the harbor. I tried to warn him. Apparently I was too late, or someone was watching the channel, or both. Or your call to Kenji is what flagged the location. The words hit Declan like something physical. He absorbed them without stepping back, but the absorption was visible. You think I led them to Kenji? I think the timeline fits. I think you're looking for a reason to make this my fault, because the alternative is that your own security protocol was already compromised before I touched it. Declan's voice had gone from compressed to something raw. I think you've been so careful for so long about who you trust that you've forgotten the difference between caution and isolation, and I think that's going to kill people faster than any leak. Cassian looked at him for a long moment. Sit down, he said. I'm not Declan. And the name came out differently than the rest of it. Not a command, not the orchestrated flatness. Something older. Something that had been there a long time. Sit down. Declan sat down. He sat in the seat across the aisle from Cassian, and he put his elbows on his knees and dropped his head for a moment. And when he came back up, the rawness was still there, but it had changed shape, become something less combative and more exhausted. Two men who had apparently been carrying a long argument for years and were now having it in the worst possible circumstances. Avery looked out the window. The sky above the cloud cover was clear and pale and entirely indifferent. She focused on her breathing, in through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth. Not because she was managing panic, but because her body was running high on cortisol, and the deliberate breathing was a way of telling it something her brain wasn't fully convinced of yet. That there was still time to think, still time to assess, that this was survivable. She wasn't sure she believed it. Without the drive, Cassian had nothing to use against Lucien that existed outside his own testimony. And the testimony of a man running an organization built on things that didn't survive legal examination was not the kind of testimony that ended criminal empires. It was the kind that got used against the person giving it. She thought about the footage of Kenji's secondary location burning. An accelerant fire. Fast. Deliberate. The kind of fire you set when you want to be sure. She thought about Lucien. A man she'd never seen, whose face she didn't know, who existed in this story so far only through the damage he'd done. The harbor, the inside operatives, the precision of an attack organized well enough to kill 37 trained security personnel. Kenji. She thought about the person who had shifted their weight in the briefing room. It hadn't been Declan. She turned back to the front of the cabin. It wasn't Declan, she said. Both men looked at her. She hadn't entirely planned to say it out loud, but it was there, and it was true. And in the specific calculus of the situation, letting them spend the next 4 hours aimed at each other seemed like a worse option than the discomfort of inserting herself into something she hadn't been invited into. In the briefing room, she said, when Cassian mentioned the drive, someone shifted their weight. I noted it. It wasn't Declan. She paused. Declan didn't move when the drive came up, because he already knew about it. There was nothing to react to. Cassian was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Fully present, fully directed, the kind of attention that had a physical quality to it. Describe the shift, he said. Right foot, outward, half a step. Body weight transferred slightly left. Someone who received new information and had a physical response to it before they controlled the response. She held his gaze. It was one of the 4 people I didn't know, second from the left against the wall. A silence. Cassian looked at Sable. Sable's face had gone very still in the way it went still when she was processing something at speed. "That would be Mercer," she said. Henrik Mercer. He's been with the security division for how long?" 2 years. He came from the Harlan operation before it folded. "The Harlan operation," Cassian said slowly, "which folded because Lucian absorbed it." The sentence finished itself. Declan had his eyes closed. Not in denial, in the specific expression of a person adding numbers and getting a sum they'd hoped not to reach. "Mercer was in the convoy last night," he said. "He was in the advance vehicle." "Which put him at the depot when I called Kenji," Cassian said. "Which means he could have monitored the secondary channel call through the depot's communication system if he had access credentials." "He had access credentials," Sable said. "All senior security personnel do." The jet leveled off. The engine noise settled into its cruising register, steady and indifferent. Outside the windows, the cloud layer had given way to a long stretch of empty white landscape far below. The flatlands of the Midwest from altitude, featureless and cold. "Is Mercer on this plane?" Avery asked. The question landed in the space between Sable and Cassian like a dropped stone. "No," Sable said. "He was in the third vehicle. He's at the depot." "Then he's going to know we've identified him in approximately..." Avery looked at her watch. "However long it takes him to realize Sable has pulled the communication log, and the log shows his access." "He'll run," Declan said. "Or he'll report in," Cassian said, "which is worse." "What does he know about Wyoming?" Another silence. This one had a different quality. Heavier, more specific. The silence of an answer that nobody wanted to be the one to say. "He was present at the security review for the Wyoming property," Sable said, 6 weeks ago. Standard protocol for senior personnel when a safe location is being prepared for potential use. The Wyoming property. The one they were currently flying toward, the one that had last verified clean 48 hours ago, the one that was their only remaining viable secure location. The one Henrik Mercer knew about. Avery felt the information settle into her body the way bad news settles, starting in the chest, moving outward. She thought about the jet they were on, the airstrip they were heading toward, the mountain estate waiting in the Wyoming snow. She thought about a man sitting in a depot in Chicago right now, watching a communication log and understanding what it meant that it had been pulled. "We need to abort," she said. Cassian looked at her. "If he reports the Wyoming location before we land, we're flying into a prepared position." She kept her voice level and clinical, the voice she used when a patient's condition was deteriorating faster than the plan accounted for. "We need to either change destination or accept that we're walking into something that knows we're coming." "Changing destination requires an alternative, Suck," Cassian said. "Do you have one?" The pause before his answer was its own answer. They had nothing left. No drive. No Kenji. No secure location that hadn't been touched by Mercer's knowledge. The organization had been gutted from within by people Lucien had placed over years, and the only thing Cassian had left was a jet full of people he could no longer be entirely certain about, and a set of injuries that were going to stop cooperating with his willpower sometime in the next several hours. Avery sat with that reality for a moment. Then she said, "The drive." Cassian looked at her. "You said the financial records go back 6 years. You said they cover transactions, payments, contracts, names." She leaned forward slightly. "You're the one who copied them. You spent 6 years inside the organization building the case for those records. You know what's in them. Knowing what's in them isn't the same as having them." "No, but it's a start." She held his gaze. "What do you remember?" Something moved in his face. "You want me to reconstruct from memory what's on an encrypted drive that no longer exists," he said. "I want to know what we have without the drive. I want to know if there's anything that exists outside that drive. Anything that corroborates what you know, anything that's already in the world and just needs someone to point at it." She paused. "Because right now, you have a plane full of people, a compromised destination, a mole who's either running or calling in, and no evidence. If we land in Wyoming with nothing, we're just targets." The cabin was very quiet. Declan was watching Cassian with an expression that was impossible to read entirely. Part assessment, part something older. The specific attention of someone who has watched a person for a long time and is watching them now at what might be a turning point. Cassian was quiet for 30 seconds. Then he said, "There's a banker." Avery waited. His name is Aldrich Pruess. He runs private wealth management through a shell structure based in Vienna, but physically operating out of a building in the near north side. He processed the financial transfers for Lucian's trafficking partnership for 18 months before I found out about it. He paused. Pruess is not loyal to Lucian. He's loyal to his own survival. If Lucian's operation collapses, Pruess is exposed. Everything he processed becomes evidence against him as an accessory. He has copies of his own records. He's kept them as insurance. You know this. I've known it for 8 months, and you didn't use it. I was waiting until I had everything, until I could move on Lucian and Pruess simultaneously so neither could warn the other. He said it without defensiveness, just the logic of it, laid out clean. The drive was supposed to be the foundation. Pruess's records were the structure on top. But Pruess's records still exist. If he hasn't destroyed them, would he destroy them? A beat. Not unless someone told him to. Has anyone told him to? Cassian looked at Sable. Sable checked something on her phone with rapid, precise movements. No communication flagged between Lucian's network and any contact associated with Pruess in the last 24 hours. Then the records still exist, Avery said. Getting to Pruess requires going back into Chicago, Cassian said, or getting him out. Either way, it requires someone he doesn't know is connected to me, because the moment Lucian's network sees a known associate approaching Pruess, then it needs to be someone Lucian doesn't have in his database, Avery said. The sentence finished itself a second time in the same hour. They both knew what she'd just said. They both knew what it meant. She could see in his face that he knew, and she could see that he was going to try to find another option, and she could see from the way his jaw moved and then stilled that he wasn't finding one. "No," he said. "I'm already in this. This is different. You said my skill set was useful." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Approaching a private banker for a conversation is not a combat situation. It's a conversation. I'm a civilian with no known connections to your organization. If Lucien's network is monitoring Pruess, they're looking for your people, not for an ER nurse from the north side. They have your face. They have footage of me helping you into a vehicle. They know I exist. They don't know what I look like in a different context, in different clothes, walking into a building that has nothing to do with you. Cassian looked at her for a long time. Declan said nothing. Sable said nothing. The jet moved through the pale sky, and somewhere far below, Henrik Mercer was either running or calling in, and either way, the Wyoming property was now a question mark sitting at the end of their trajectory. If we divert, Sable said carefully, we need to file a new flight plan within the next 18 minutes, or the deviation triggers monitoring. Divert to where? Declan asked. Nobody answered. Avery held Cassian's gaze and didn't look away and didn't soften what was in her face, because she was past the point of softening things for anyone, including herself. She was an ER nurse who'd been awake for over 24 hours and had treated a gunshot wound in her living room and evacuated her home in 3 minutes, and was now flying toward a compromised safe location on a plane that had been carrying a mole 6 hours ago. She was past the point where gentle presentation changed anything. "Make the call," she said. Cassian looked at her for one more moment. Something in his eyes that she still didn't have a full word for. Something that lived in the space between calculation and something more human than calculation. And then he looked at Sable. "Divert," he said. "Milwaukee Executive Airport. We need a vehicle and a clean safe house within 2 miles of the near north side of Chicago." He paused. "And I need someone to tell me that Mercer hasn't made a call in the last 10 minutes. Sable was already moving. Declan stood and walked to the front of the cabin and stood there with his back to everyone, looking out the cockpit-adjacent window at the pale sky ahead. And Avery could see from the set of his shoulders that he was doing the same thing she was, running the math, looking at what was left, trying to find a configuration of the remaining pieces that produced a viable outcome. The math was not generous. No drive, no Kenji. Wyoming burned before they'd landed. One banker in Chicago who might have records and might destroy them the moment he got scared. A mole in the organization who was either running or talking. Cassian with cracked ribs and a gunshot wound and a blood loss deficit that was going to call in its debt whether he acknowledged it or not. And her, a woman with a nursing degree and no identification to her real name beyond what Lucian's people already had. being volunteered for a conversation with a private banker who processed money for human traffickers. The jet banked. Milwaukee. Avery pressed her back against the seat and closed her eyes for 30 seconds. Not sleeping, not resting, just taking the 30 seconds to be fully honest with herself about what she was agreeing to, because she'd learned a long time ago that the worst decisions were the ones made without that honesty. The ones where you told yourself a partial story about what was happening and then were surprised by the part you'd... Milwaukee. Executive Airport was a small operation. 2 runways, a modest terminal building, the kind of facility that existed to service private aviation without the infrastructure overhead of a major hub. The jet touched down at 7:43 in the morning and taxied to a private hangar where a single black sedan was already waiting, engine running, no driver visible through the tinted glass. Sable had arranged it in 18 minutes from the air. Avery didn't ask how. She came down the jet stairs into cold that was sharper than Chicago's had been, drier, with a wind that cut rather than pressed, and she stood on the tarmac for 3 seconds and breathed it in and told her body that it had more to do before it got to stop. Her body did not respond enthusiastically. 27 hours without sleep. The specific depletion of sustained adrenaline, the kind of exhaustion that lives in the eye sockets and the joints and produces a particular clarity that is almost indistinguishable from calm until it isn't. The drive to Chicago took an hour and 40 minutes. She spent it in the back seat with Cassian while Declan drove and Sable navigated and 2 other personnel followed in a second vehicle that had materialized from somewhere Avery no longer had the bandwidth to question. She spent it going over the approach to Aldrich Pruis 3 times. The script, the contingencies, the specific pressure points that Cassian laid out with the methodical precision of a man who had been building a case against this banker for 8 months and knew his psychology better than Pruis probably knew it himself. Pruis was 53. He had a daughter at Northwestern. He had a second property in Door County that his wife didn't know he paid for, which meant a second life that his wife didn't know about, which meant leverage of the conventional kind that Avery was not going to use but needed to know existed. He was risk-averse by nature. The trafficking work had been profitable enough to override his instincts for 2 years, but had almost certainly been keeping him awake at night, which meant part of him had been looking for an exit that didn't require him to expose himself. He wants a way out, she said. He wants to survive, Cassian said, which is the same thing in his case. So I give him one. You give him the appearance of one. Tell him the records already exist in other hands, that his exposure is coming regardless of what he does, but cooperation now is the only path that ends with him in a reduced position rather than a maximum one. He paused. Don't threaten. He responds to threats by shutting down and calling attorneys. Present it as information, as a courtesy. Who am I? Why am I there? You're a compliance consultant, independent. You are engaged by a banking oversight body. He won't know which one, and he won't ask because asking confirms he has something to be scared of. Cassian's voice was steady and even, and she could hear underneath it the effort of keeping it that way. The ribs were audible in his breathing now, a faint catch on the inhale that he was working to suppress. You're giving him 48 hours to make a decision, and if he's already been contacted by Lucian's side, then you'll know within the first 2 minutes of the conversation, and you leave. His eyes found hers. Don't negotiate with a burned contact. Just leave. She held his gaze. And if something else goes wrong? Define else. If Lucian's people are already there, if the building is being watched, if I walk in and it's not a conversation I can walk out of. The car was quiet for a moment. There'll be a vehicle on the south side of the building, Declan said from the front. Black Tahoe. Keys in the wheel well. If you need to move fast, move to that. And if I can't reach that vehicle? Nobody answered. She turned back to the window and watched the Illinois border approach and decided that not answering was itself an answer, and that the answer was improvise, which was the answer she'd been working with since she'd found a dying man on her front porch in a blizzard and decided to drag him inside. She was apparently still improvising. She had apparently become a person for whom improvisation was the primary mode. She thought about what Declan had said on the plane stairs. Be careful with him, not because he's dangerous. She looked at Cassian from the corner of her eye. He was watching the road with that inward quality she'd cataloged, running scenarios, adjusting, managing the operational space inside his head. His left hand was resting on his knee, and the right was pressed against his rib cage, and he was doing the breathing thing, the controlled management of pain through deliberate rhythm, and she recognized it from her patients. The ones who were tough in a way that had stopped being voluntary and just became the only mode available. She looked away. The near north side address for Pruis's operation was a 12-story building on a street that managed to be both expensive and anonymous, the kind of architecture that corporate wealth produces when it doesn't want to look like it's trying. Clean stone facade, modest signage, the kind of lobby visible through the glass doors that suggested quality without display. Declan pulled the car to the curb half a block down. "Comms," Sable said, and handed Avery an earpiece so small it was nearly invisible. "One way. We can hear you. We can't respond without risking detection if you're scanned. Don't look for acknowledgement." Avery put it in. "You have a phone. It's clean. No traceable connection to anything. The number for Pruis's direct line is in the contacts under the name Fletcher." Sable's voice was professionally even. "If the meeting runs past 20 minutes, we'll initiate contact as a fire alarm to the building. You'll have 2 minutes to exit cleanly." 20 minutes is enough? It has to be. Avery got out of the car. She had on clothes that Sable had sourced during the drive. Dark trousers, a charcoal coat, a briefcase that contained 3 sheets of paper, a tablet with documents she hadn't fully read, and nothing else. She looked like a professional. She felt like a woman who hadn't slept in over a day and was about to walk into a building to convince a money launderer to hand over evidence against a criminal empire using a cover identity she'd been briefed on 40 minutes ago. She walked towards the building. The lobby was warmer than the street and smelled of the specific combination of fresh air systems and carpet that expensive corporate spaces produce. A reception desk, a security station, 2 people behind it who looked at her with the calibrated professional attention of people paid to assess without being obvious about assessing. She gave them the name Fletcher. She said she had an appointment with Mr. Pruis's office. She said it with the specific confident boredom of a person who did this routinely in many buildings and found this particular one unremarkable. They called up. They waited. They told her to take the elevator to the 9th floor. She took the elevator to the 9th floor. She stood in it alone with the hum of the mechanism and her own reflection in the polished door, and she did the breathing exercise, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. And when the doors opened, she walked out with her face arranged in the expression of a person arriving for a routine and mildly inconvenient professional obligation. Pruis was waiting in a conference room. He was smaller than she'd expected from the way Cassian had described him. Slight, with the particular build of a person who had been slender young and stayed that way into middle age through discipline rather than metabolism. Gray at the temples, very clean in the way of someone for whom personal presentation was a form of control. He stood when she came in, which told her he was either genuinely polished or genuinely nervous, and she assessed him across the handshake and the careful exchange of professional pleasantries and decided it was both. She sat down. She opened the briefcase. She placed the 3 sheets of paper on the table face down and left them there, which she'd been told to do. The presence of physical documents without their content visible was its own pressure mechanism, more effective than showing them immediately. "Mr. Pruis," she said, "I'm going to be straightforward with you because I think you're a person who prefers that." He looked at the papers. "Go ahead. You've been processing structured transfers for a private entity operating under the shell designation Volant Capital Group for 18 months, ending approximately 6 weeks ago." She held his gaze and didn't soften what came next. The transfers total approximately $47 million across 14 accounts in 4 jurisdictions. The source entity for those transfers has been identified as a partnership between an organized crime operation and a private military contractor with documented ties to trafficking networks. Pruis said nothing. His left hand, which had been resting on the table, moved slightly. Not away, not toward anything. Just a fractional tensing of the fingers. "The documentation of those transfers," she said, "exists in several places. Some of those places are beyond anyone's ability to access. Some are not." She paused. "The 48 hours I'm giving you is not a deadline for cooperation. It's a window in which your voluntary provision of your own records would be treated as proactive compliance rather than compelled disclosure. I'd need to involve my legal counsel before. I'd recommend against that at this stage." She said it gently, not as a threat, exactly as Cassian had coached her. Information, not pressure. Legal counsel involvement creates a paper trail of your awareness, which reclassifies the nature of any subsequent action. Right now, you're in a position to be a witness rather than a subject. That window is genuinely limited. Bruce looked at the face-down papers. "What's on those?" he asked. "A summary of what already exists in other hands." She turned them over. She watched his face as he read. She watched the color shift, not drain completely, but change. A specific blanching that started at the jawline and moved upward. His breathing became audible. He set the papers down after 40 seconds and looked at them as if he could revise their content through sustained attention. "I need time," he said. "You have 48 hours. "I need more than—" "You don't have more than that." She kept her voice level, almost sympathetic, because Cassian had told her that Pruess's psychology required the conversation to feel collaborative rather than coercive. "I'm sorry, that's the actual window." The silence stretched. Then Pruess said, "The records I have, they're more complete than what you're describing." "I know. They go beyond the 18 months. They go back further. The Volant structure was— There are things in those records that involve people whose names would—" He stopped himself. "I understand. If I provide them, what guarantee— I'm not in a position to offer guarantees. I can tell you how the process works and what proactive cooperation has historically produced in situations structured like this one." She held his gaze. "But I can't promise you an outcome. Nobody can do that honestly." He looked at her. She held the look. 34 seconds. She counted them. Before he looked down at the table and said, "I'll need a secure transfer protocol." The earpiece in her ear was silent, as promised, but she felt the information land with a weight that she understood would matter. That in a car half a block away, Cassian Voss had just heard a frightened banker agree to give them the thing they'd lost when Kenji's secondary location burned. She had been in the building for 11 minutes. She stood up. She said she'd be in touch with transfer protocols within 6 hours. She said it with the same professional boredom she'd carried in with her, and she picked up the briefcase and the papers, and she walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and into the elevator. And it was only when the elevator doors closed that she let herself lean against the wall for 3 seconds and close her eyes. Then the elevator reached the lobby, and she straightened and walked through the lobby and out the door and down the sidewalk toward the car. She was 15 feet from the car when she saw Declan's expression through the windshield, not the controlled assessment face. Something else, something that made her move faster without deciding to move faster, the body ahead of the brain, and she got to the car and opened the door and got in and said, "What?" "Mercer made a call," Sable said from the front, 40 minutes ago, before we jammed his communication. He had time. Avery looked at Cassian. Cassian looked back at her, and his face had gone into that stillness again. But this time it wasn't the stillness of absorbing bad news. It was the stillness of a man who has already moved past the bad news into what comes after it. "How long do we have?" she asked. "We don't know that Mercer gave them this location specifically," Declan said. "He knew about Wyoming. He didn't necessarily know about—" "He knew about Pruess," Cassian said. The sentence dropped into the car like something solid. "The compliance review 6 weeks ago, when Mercer was present." Cassian's voice was measured and quiet. "Pruess's building was part of the Chicago operational map that was reviewed at that meeting. If Mercer was feeding Lucian information for months, the map was compromised. Lucian knows this address." Avery looked out the car window at the building she'd just walked out of, at the lobby doors, at the street. "Drive," she said. Declan drove. They moved fast through the near north side. Not recklessly, but with the aggressive efficiency of a driver who knew exactly what they were doing, threading lights, choosing the right lanes with the instinctive precision of someone who had done tactical driving for years. Sable was on the phone in a rapid clipped conversation that Avery couldn't follow, and Cassian sat beside her with his jaw set and his hand pressed against his ribs, and she could see from the quality of his breathing that the physical margin he'd been operating on was getting thin. "You need to stop moving," she said, low, just to him. Later. "Your lung, I know." "Cassian." She said his name the way she said things to patients who were making choices against their own survival. Not soft, just direct. "If you collapse in the middle of what's coming next, it doesn't matter what Pruess gives us." He looked at her. "What's coming next is we find a location, We establish contact with Pruce's secure transfer, and we transmit whatever he sends us before Lucian's side figures out what we're doing. And if they find us before the transfer completes? He didn't answer immediately. There's a property, Declan said from the front. Industrial space in Pilsen, off-grid, not on any operational map I've seen in the last 2 years. I used it personally. It's not connected to the organization in any documented way. How personal? Cassian asked. Completely. It's in my name. My private name, not a shell. A pause. Which means Lucien doesn't have it, because if he had it, he'd have used it against me already. Cassian was quiet for a moment. How far? 12 minutes. The 12 minutes passed in the specific compressed time of a car full of people calculating odds. Avery watched the city slide by outside the windows. Chicago at morning, going about its post-blizzard recovery, sidewalks being cleared, traffic resuming its normal rhythms, the city machine functioning in its ordinary way, entirely indifferent to the small convoy threading through it. The Pilsen space was a converted auto repair shop on a side street that dead-ended at a chain-link fence overlooking the rail yard. Declan had a key. The interior was cold and dark, concrete floors, a hydraulic lift that hadn't been used in years, a back office with a table and 2 chairs, and a space heater that took 4 minutes to make a dent in the temperature. They got Cassian into one of the chairs. Avery pulled his coat aside and checked the dressing on his ribs without asking permission. He let her, which told her more than his face did. The hemostatic dressing on his sidewound was intact, but the bruising from the cracked ribs had spread and darkened overnight in the way of serious rib injuries. And when she palpated carefully, he made the brief involuntary sound again, the one that came out despite the jaw being set against it. The 2 of these are worse than I thought, she said. The 3rd one I'm worried about. Worried how? The placement. If it shifts... She stopped herself from completing the sentence in the way she would have for a patient, because he wasn't a patient. He was a man who needed to stay functional for the next several hours, and frightening him about the specifics wasn't going to help either of them. Stay still when you can. Don't take impacts to that side. I'll keep that in mind. She taped the dressing tighter, which would help marginally, and gave him 2 more ibuprofen from the small supplies she'd had in her bag, which would help marginally less than he needed and more than nothing. She stepped back. Sable had the tablet out. She'd established contact with a secure transfer protocol and sent it to the number Avery had used for Pruis, and they were waiting, the specific waiting of a situation where the next thing to happen was outside their control, dependent on a frightened banker in a 9th-floor conference room deciding that his survival instinct was stronger than his paralysis. 15 minutes. 20. Declan was at the window that faced the street, watching the dead-end approach with the steady vigilance of someone who had been doing this kind of watching for years and had learned to read a street's normal rhythms well enough to notice when they changed. 26 minutes after they arrived, Sable's tablet notified. The transfer had initiated. It was a large file. Pruce had not been understating the depth of his records. Sable watched the progress on the tablet, and the percentage climbed with the specific agonizing slowness of a large file moving through a secure encrypted channel, and Avery stood beside her and watched the number climb and felt every percentage point in her chest. 42%, 58. Vehicle, Declan said from the window. His voice had changed, not loud, but with the specific compression of someone delivering tactical information. Everyone in the room went still. 1 vehicle, dark, moving slow. He paused. Stopped. 67%. 2 men out. They're looking at the building. Cassian was on his feet. He'd moved from the chair before Avery had registered him moving, and she saw in the way he was standing that the pain from the ribs had been shunted somewhere else, into a different register, the physiological override that happens when survival demands it, the body reallocating resources from sensation to function. How did they find this location? Declan said it quietly, and there was something in his voice that Avery hadn't heard from him before, not accusation this time, something closer to grief. They didn't follow us, Sable said. We ran counter-surveillance through 4 direction changes. Then someone told them. The sentence sat in the cold air of the repair shop and nobody finished it. But everyone in the room was doing the same calculation, arriving at the same uncomfortable set of possible conclusions. 79%, Sable said. How long for the remainder? Cassian asked. 4 minutes. Maybe 5. From the street, distant but clarifying. The sound of more vehicles. Not one. Not two. Declan turned from the window. His face was stripped down to something functional and certain, the specific expression of a man who has run out of versions of the situation that don't require action. There are 4 vehicles. They're blocking the street entrance. Avery looked at the tablet. 81%. She looked at Cassian. He was looking back at her with those gray eyes, and the thing in them was different now from every other time she'd looked into them over the past 24 hours. Not the controlled assessment, not the calculation, not the carefully managed admission of cost. Something raw, something that acknowledged without saying it that the next several minutes were going to require something from all of them that couldn't be managed or calculated or controlled. "The rail yard," he said. "Through the back." "The fence?" "I saw a gate at the south end when we drove in, padlocked." He looked at Declan. "Can you get through a padlocked gate?" Declan reached into his jacket and produced a compact bolt cutter that he'd apparently been carrying as a matter of course. He said nothing. He walked toward the back of the shop. Sable moved toward the back exit, tablet in hand, watching the percentage climb. 86. Avery picked up her bag, and then the front of the building exploded inward. Not a bomb. A battering vehicle, something heavy driven directly into the roll-up door, the metal folding and shrieking and the cold air of the street flooding in with it. And in the sudden breach, Avery saw the shapes of men moving in fast tactical formation, and her body moved before her brain caught up, moving toward the back of the building, toward Declan and the bolt cutter and the gate. Sable was still watching the tablet, running with it, 91%. Cassian was beside her. She could hear his breathing, the catch on the inhale that was worse now, that the movement was costing him. And behind them there were shouts, the specific controlled shouting of people moving through a space in formation. And there was a sound she recognized from the trauma bay, the sound of a body impacting a surface at velocity, and she didn't look back. Declan hit the back door and it opened, and the cold of the rail yard hit them. Open space, the smell of iron and gravel, the elevated tracks 20 meters ahead, and the fence with the gate at the south end exactly where Cassian had said it was. She was running. She hadn't run seriously since a hospital evacuation drill 2 years ago, and her body remembered it with the complaint of someone who hadn't been warned. Her bag was hitting her hip with every stride, the gravel of the rail yard uneven under her feet, and beside her Cassian was keeping pace, and she could hear what it was costing him in that breathing. Declan reached the gate. The bolt cutter went through the padlock in one motion, practiced, efficient, the movement of someone who had done it before. The gate swung. They went through. Behind them, not far enough behind, the sound of the back door of the repair shop opening, shouted instructions, the sound of feet on gravel. They were in the rail yard proper now, the elevated tracks above them casting shadow in the morning light. The yard extending in both directions with the labyrinthine complexity of a facility built for function over navigability. Sable had the tablet against her chest as she ran. She looked at the screen. Avery caught her face. "How much?" Avery said between breaths. Sable looked at her. 97%, she said. 3%. 3% of Aldrich Pruce's complete records. 18 months of transfers. The names of every politician, every official, every contractor that Lucien Voss had purchased or partnered with, sitting in a transfer queue that they needed 3 more minutes and a functioning signal to complete. While behind them, the men who worked for the person those records would destroy were closing the distance across a frozen rail yard. Cassian grabbed her arm, not hard, but with the specific grip of a person conveying urgency through touch. She looked at him. His face was drawn tight with the effort of running and breathing simultaneously, and his eyes were completely clear. "Signal," he said. "We need high ground. The tracks." She looked up at the elevated rail structure above them. The access ladder was 20 feet away, iron rungs bolted to a concrete support pillar, leading up to the elevated track bed 15 feet above the yard floor. From up there, they'd have line of sight in every direction, and they'd have elevation for the signal. They'd also have no cover. She looked at the tablet in Sable's hand. 97% still. The transfer paused because the signal down here in the shadow of the elevated structure was too degraded to complete the final 3%. She looked at Cassian. "I'll go up," she said. "Avery, you can't climb a ladder with that rib." She took the tablet from Sable's hands in one motion. 3%. 1 minute, maybe less, if I get clear of the structural interference. She held his gaze. How many people do you need to hold the base of that ladder for 60 seconds? His jaw was tight. The gray eyes were doing the calculation she could practically see running behind them. The cost, the probability, the alternatives, and coming up with the same answer she had. Go, he said. She went. The iron rungs were cold enough to sting through her gloves, and the ladder swayed slightly as she climbed, which she registered and dismissed. And behind her below she heard Declan's voice giving rapid, quiet instructions, and then the sound of the men from the building arriving at the base of the structure. And what happened next was loud. She made it to the top of the ladder. The elevated track bed was narrow. Ballast gravel and 2 rails running north to south. The ties slick with frost, the wind up here cutting without obstruction in any direction. Below, the rail yard spread out in its industrial complexity, and she could see the men from the building, 4 of them, spreading out to flank the base of the support structure. And she could see Declan and Sable and 1 other personnel moving to intercept. And she could see Cassian at the base of the ladder with 1 hand on the iron rung looking up at her. She held the tablet up and watched the signal indicator. 2 bars. Weak. The transfer was at 97% and hovering, the progress bar frozen at the threshold, and she moved along the track bed toward the north end of the structure where the elevation was slightly higher and the line of sight to the nearest cell tower. She was guessing, working on instinct and the memory of signal behavior from years of checking her phone in coverage dead zones, would be marginally better. 3 bars. The progress bar moved. 98. Below her, the sounds of the confrontation had condensed into something more immediate. She could hear Declan's voice, short and sharp, and the sound of physical impact. And she did not look down because looking down was not going to help the transfer complete, and the transfer completing was the only thing that mattered right now. 99. The wind hit her sideways, and she planted her feet wider on the track bed and held the tablet with both hands and watched the screen and breathed. 100%. Transfer complete. She looked at the screen for a moment. Just a moment, the documents distributed, the records sent to the 3 federal oversight addresses Sable had set up, the investigative journalists, the international banking regulators, $47 million of documented transfers, names, dates, account numbers, the complete forensic architecture of what Lucien Voss had built. Gone, dispersed, impossible to call back or erase. She put the tablet in her bag. She went back to the ladder. Going down was harder than going up. Her hands were cold enough that the grip was effortful, and she was moving as fast as she could manage, and she was 3 rungs from the bottom when she dropped and landed on the gravel and went to 1 knee. Cassian caught her arm. His grip was the same as the first time, on her front porch in the blizzard, that specific wrong direction strength of a man running on something past his physical margin. But it was there. He was there. Done? He said. Done. He let go of her arm. They ran. The running lasted 4 more minutes, through the rail yard, south along the fence line, to a road that bordered the yard where Sable had a vehicle waiting that Avery did not ask the provenance of. They got in. They moved. Declan was bleeding from a cut above his eye that was producing the specific volume that head wounds produce, dramatic and fast, soaking the collar of his jacket. And he drove anyway, 1 hand pressing a wadded cloth to the cut with the practical indifference of a person who had bled before and had prioritized correctly. Sable was on the phone. The 3rd personnel member, a man named Walsh, who had never said a word to Avery across the entire duration of this situation, was sitting in the back seat beside her, pressing a hand to his left side in a way she recognized. She looked at him. Walsh. He looked at her. Let me see. He moved his hand. She assessed. Not a gunshot. A blade wound, shallow but long, across the lower left ribs. Bleeding controlled but consistent. She got the medical kit from her bag. Depleted now, 3 days into a situation that had been 1 night's worth of emergency, and she worked on him in the moving car, which was not ideal, and she did it well enough. He said nothing the entire time. When she finished and sat back, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Thank you, he said. It came out like something he didn't say often. Don't thank me yet, she said. That needs proper closure in a real facility within the next 6 hours. He nodded once. Then he went back to looking out the window in silence. Sable ended her call. The transmissions went through, she said. All 3 federal addresses confirmed receipt. The journalist contacts are responding. The banking regulators, she paused, reading something on her phone, have flagged it as priority for the Financial Crimes Unit. Nobody celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate yet. There was relief of a technical kind. The confirmation that the thing they'd been trying to do was done, but it sat inside a context that was still dangerous and still unresolved, and the people in the car had been operating in that context long enough to know the difference between a task completed and a situation ended. Lucien, Cassian said. His Gold Coast property went active 40 minutes ago, Sable said. He's there. He'll know about the transmissions. Within the hour, the organizations receiving those transmissions move fast. They'll have preliminary holds in place before the day is out. Sable paused. His network will start fracturing. The people connected to him who have their own exposure in those records will be looking for ways to distance themselves before the holds land. That's when he becomes most dangerous, Cassian said. Avery looked at him. Cornered, he said simply. Lucian cornered is worse than Lucian in control. In control, he's strategic. Cornered, he's... He stopped. He'll come directly. He'll come for you, Declan said from the front. Yes. Then we don't wait for it. Declan's voice carried the specific weight of a decision already made. We go to the Gold Coast property. The silence in the car lasted approximately 4 seconds. That's what he expects, Sable said. He expects us to run, Declan said. He's been chasing us for 3 days. He's going to wake up this morning to news that the transmissions went out, and he's going to understand that his window has closed, and the only move left is to eliminate the source before the testimony matters. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Cassian. The source is you. He'll come with everything he has left. Let's choose the ground. The Gold Coast property was a building that didn't announce itself. No signage, residential facade, the kind of building that existed in that neighborhood as a relic of old money that had decided privacy was the ultimate luxury. They were on the street outside it in 40 minutes, the second vehicle from Pilsen having rejoined them 2 miles back. It was 11:20 in the morning. The city was going about its business in the tentative way of a city recovering from a major storm, plows still running, salt trucks on the main roads, people moving with the specific deliberate care of navigating surfaces they couldn't fully trust. Ordinary. The specific ordinary of a world that didn't know what was happening inside the buildings it moved past. They went in through a service entrance that Sable had codes for. Codes that were either old enough to be outdated or recent enough to still be valid, and they were valid, which told Avery something about the quality of Sable's operational preparation that she filed away without comment. The interior was what she might have predicted from the exterior. Expensive in a way that had nothing to do with display, the kind of expensive that was entirely functional, every object chosen for quality without visible concern for what it communicated. The ground floor was empty. The second floor was empty. The third floor had 2 men who encountered Declan and were not a problem after that, in ways that Avery did not watch closely and did not ask about. Lucien Voss was on the 4th floor. She knew it before they reached it. There was a quality to the building that had changed, a specific alertness to the air on the upper level, the sense of a space that was occupied by someone who was expecting something. Cassian stopped at the 4th floor landing. He stood with his hand on the door and his breathing controlled and deliberate, and his face arranged in the expression she'd cataloged across 3 days as his operational face, the one that had nothing personal in it, that ran on calculation and managed everything else underneath. But she was close enough now to see underneath it. He was 41 years old and he'd been running something he never wanted to run since he was in his 20s, and his brother had just tried to kill him and had succeeded in killing 37 other people, including a man named Kenji, who he clearly hadn't let himself grieve yet, and he had cracked ribs and a gunshot wound, and he was standing at a door that his brother was on the other side of. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. Not the operational look, not the calculation. The actual look. The one she'd seen in fragments across the duration of this, unguarded, briefly, in the way of a person who has run out of the energy required to guard everything simultaneously. "I'll be right behind you," she said. He held her gaze for 1 moment. Then he opened the door. Lucien Voss was standing at the window. He was younger looking than she'd constructed from description. The 4 years less than Cassian were visible in a kind of unfinished quality, something that hadn't yet settled into its final shape. He was dressed as if he'd been expecting a meeting rather than a confrontation, which she understood was its own form of confrontation, the performance of composure as a weapon. He turned when the door opened. He looked at Cassian. Something moved through his face. Not surprise, not the collapse of a person caught. Something older and more complicated. The specific expression of someone who has spent years building toward a moment and is now standing inside it and finding it both exactly what they expected and entirely different. "You actually came," Lucian said. "Yes. I thought you'd run, send lawyers, intermediaries." He looked at Cassian with an expression that Avery, from her position near the door, could only partially read. "You always preferred distance." "I'm done preferring things," Cassian said. Lucian's eyes moved to Avery, assessed her with a quick, comprehensive look, moved back to Cassian. "The nurse, the one who kept you alive. Her name is Avery Calloway. I know her name." Something in Lucian's voice had an edge to it that was almost conversational, almost ordinary, the kind of voice you used in discussions rather than confrontations, which made it worse somehow. 47 people are dead because you decided to copy files instead of talking to me." 47 people are dead because you put them in that warehouse, Cassian said. "I put them there because you wouldn't listen. You wouldn't move. You sat on top of everything and refused to let it grow and refused to let anyone else have a say. You partnered with traffickers, Lucian." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Lucian's jaw moved. That's a simplification. It's an accurate description of a specific set of financial transfers that are currently in the possession of 3 federal agencies, 2 investigative journalists, and an international banking regulatory body. Cassian's voice was even, stripped of everything except the fact. "It's over. What's left to decide is how you walk out of this building." "You think I'll walk out of this building?" Lucien said it slowly, not as a question. "I think the people downstairs have secured your remaining personnel. I think the transmissions that went out this morning have already triggered preliminary holds on the financial network. I think within 72 hours, the infrastructure is gone." Cassian paused. "I think you have a choice. Cooperation with investigators gets you a process. Running gets you a manhunt." Lucien looked at him for a long time. "You'd testify," he said. "Against your own, I already agreed to cooperate fully. That agreement was made 2 hours ago." Cassian held his brother's gaze. "It's done." Something happened in Lucian's face, the composure architecture cracking along specific lines, showing what was underneath, which was not the calculated ambition Avery had expected, but something raw. Something that might have been, underneath everything, a much older and simpler thing. A younger brother who had wanted something from an older one and had chosen the most catastrophic possible method of trying to take it. She was not moved by this. She thought about 37 people, about Kenji, about the fire at the secondary location. She was not moved by it, but she watched Cassian's face while he watched his brother, and she saw that he was not entirely unmoved, and she understood what that cost him, and she said nothing about it. Lucien sat down. He sat down in the chair by the window as if something in him had reached a structural limit, the collapse of a person who has been running on a particular fuel for a long time and has just discovered it's gone. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and then at his brother, and the expression on his face was something she didn't have an exact clinical word for. Not remorse, which implies a clean relationship to what's been done, something more tangled and less resolved. "The harbor," he said, quietly. "Yes," Cassian said. "I didn't—" He stopped. "I told them to take you alive." "I know. That's supposed to mean something." "It means something," Cassian said. "It doesn't mean everything." Sable made the call. Federal agents arrived at the Gold Coast property at 12:47 in the afternoon, which was fast enough that the preliminary coordination had clearly been in motion for longer than the morning's transmissions. Lucien Voss was taken into custody without physical incident. He walked to the vehicle under his own power, which she supposed was something. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building and watched the vehicles pull away. Declan stood beside her. His head wound had been properly dressed. She'd done it herself in a bathroom on the 3rd floor while they waited. And he looked like a man who had been through 3 days of sustained crisis and was only now beginning to feel the weight of what had been held at a distance by adrenaline. 37, he said. She looked at him. I keep counting them, he said. I keep going through the names. That's appropriate, she said. That's what you should be doing. He looked at her with something in his face she recognized from the ER. The specific expression of a person encountering, without warning, a piece of truth they weren't prepared for. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. He walked back into the building. She stayed on the sidewalk. The city moved around her in its ordinary way. A woman walking a dog, two people arguing about the best route around a snow closure, a delivery truck trying to negotiate a turn too tight for its wheelbase, the mundane machinery of a city going about its day, indifferent to the things that had happened inside its borders over the last 72 hours. She watched it for a while and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not relief exactly, not safety, which she understood would be a process rather than a moment, but something close to the specific sensation of ground being present beneath your feet after a period of not being certain it was. Cassian came out 20 minutes later. He moved more slowly than he had all day. The managed physicality that had been running on override was beginning to cost its debt, and she could see it in the way he placed his steps, in the set of his shoulders, in the specific quality of his breathing on the cold air. He stopped beside her. They stood together on the sidewalk, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't need structure. The federal cooperation, she said finally. When did you actually make that agreement? On the plane. He kept his eyes on the street. Before we landed in Milwaukee, while you were going over the Pruis approach, while you were running the scenario about Wyoming being compromised. Yes, she thought about that. So when you said it to Lucian, it was already done. It wasn't a negotiating position. She nodded slowly. What does full cooperation look like? Everything. Records, testimony, organizational structure, personnel, operations going back to the beginning. He paused. The organization effectively ceases to exist as a result. That's a condition of the agreement, not a consequence. She looked at him then, really looked, with the same attention she'd given him in fragments across 3 days, the 41 years of it in his face, the specific exhaustion that comes from a particular kind of carrying, the concrete gray eyes that were looking at the street and not at her. You wanted it to end, she said. Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. I've wanted it to end for a long time, he said. I didn't know how to end it without... He stopped. Without exactly what happened. She thought about that. About the cost of the answer to that problem. About the 37 people whose names Declan was counting. There's going to be an investigation, she said, into everything, including your own role. I know. You'll likely face charges. I know. And you agreed to this, voluntarily. He looked at her then, directly, fully, with that rare unguarded quality that she'd only seen in moments of extreme stress or extreme honesty, which she was beginning to understand were the same thing for him. It's the right thing, he said simply. I'm aware that's a strange thing for someone in my position to say. It's not strange, she said. It's just late. Something moved in his face at that. Not a flinch, not offense, but an honest reception of the truth of it. He took it the way he'd taken everything she'd said directly to him across these 3 days, without flinching away and without pretending it hadn't landed. Yes, he said. It's late. She looked back at the street. The dog walker had rounded the corner and was gone. The delivery truck had managed its turn. The argument about the snow route had apparently resolved itself, the two people having disappeared in separate directions. I need a hospital, she said. He turned to look at her. Not me. Walsh needs proper wound closure, and you need imaging on those ribs. And I need to sleep for approximately 11 hours before I'm capable of accurate medical assessment, which means we need someone else to handle the immediate medical needs. She paused. Is there a facility you can access that won't create complications for the federal process? He considered this for a moment. Yes. Then we should go. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it on the sidewalk. She had her phone, her medical kit, depleted, her change of clothes, her hospital ID, and the keys to a townhouse on the north side that she wasn't certain she'd be able to return to for some time. She thought about the plants on the windowsill, She thought about the blood on her couch that would never come out. She thought about a trail of red cutting through white snow on a sidewalk she'd walked for 4 years, and the specific moment she'd stopped and looked down and seen it, and the decision she'd made in the 30 seconds after that. She didn't know if it had been the right decision. She suspected it was the kind of decision that wasn't right or wrong in the clean sense, that existed in the more complicated territory of decisions made by imperfect people in impossible moments that could only be evaluated by what came after. What came after was going to take a long time to know. Months passed. The Voss organization's financial infrastructure collapsed over a period of 6 weeks. Account holds, asset seizures, the slow disassembly of a structure that had been built over decades, coming apart in the specific way of things that have been built on foundations that were always going to fail. The trafficking partnerships were dismantled. 3 sitting members of a state oversight committee were indicted. A federal circuit judge entered into cooperation negotiations. Aldrich Pruis received a substantially reduced charge in exchange for full testimony and spent the subsequent months in the specific misery of a man whose calculated survival instinct had, in the end, served him correctly. Henrik Mercer was found in Milwaukee 3 weeks after the rail yard. He had been trying to access accounts that had already been frozen and had run out of options in the ordinary way of people whose network has ceased to exist. He did not go quietly. He went eventually. Kenji was found alive. He'd moved from the secondary location 40 minutes before Mercer's intelligence reached Lucian's team, which meant Declan's call, the one that Cassian had feared had flagged the location, had in fact reached him in time. He'd left the drive in the location when he ran, which was why it had been taken. He had not been able to tell anyone he was alive for 3 weeks because the methods of reaching anyone had been compromised, and he'd been operating in a communications blackout. When Declan heard, he sat down and didn't say anything for a long time. Avery heard about it from Cassian in a phone call, standing outside Mercy General after a day shift in late March. The snow was gone. The lake was the specific gray-blue of early spring, visible from the hospital parking lot if you stood at the right angle, which she did. "Kenji's alive," Cassian said. Cassian Mutz. She stood with the phone against her ear and felt the specific physical sensation of a weight releasing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of things that have been held for a long time. A gradual release that moves through the body from the chest outward. "That's good," she said. "Yes. How is he?" "Fine." Angry at himself, getting better. "And you?" A pause. "The imaging cleared the rib concern. The other injuries are..." Another pause, and she understood this one as a man who was accustomed to treating all damage as equivalent, physical and otherwise, reaching the limit of that particular habit. "Resolving." She looked at the lake. "The foundation paperwork cleared," she said. "The Trauma and Rehabilitation Center. The assets from the seizures that were redirected, the legal team says it should be operational by September." "I heard. You're going to have to testify to a lot of things between now and September." "I know. The process is going to be long, and it's going to be public, and it's going to be..." She stopped. "I'm stating things you already know." "You do that when you're trying to decide whether to say something else," he said. "I've noticed." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about that night," she said finally, "about standing on the sidewalk outside my house and seeing the blood in the snow, about the 30 seconds between seeing it and deciding to go up the steps." She watched a gull turn over the parking lot, banking on the cold lake wind. "I've been trying to figure out what that decision was, what it was based on." "What have you determined?" "That it wasn't a good decision by any rational measure," she said. "That it was a human one, which is different." She paused. "That's not a comfortable conclusion." "No," he said, "but it's honest." She thought about honesty, about what it had looked like across 3 days, in Declan's raw voice, in Cassian's admission that his suspicions had been a bad calculation, in Lucien sitting down in a chair by a window and looking at the floor. "Spring is early this year," she said. "It is. I'm working a regular schedule now, first time in 4 years. She shifted the phone to her other ear. "It's strange. I keep expecting the board to go critical." "Does it?" "Sometimes. Less than I expected." She watched the gull disappear over the roof of the parking structure. "There's a park on the lakefront, near the north end. I walk there when the shift ends early. A silence. Not an empty one. I've been told the lake is visible from there, Cassian said. It is. I'll be in Chicago for the next several weeks. The testimony schedule. A pause that she did not fill. If the shift ends early. She looked at the lake, the gray blue of it, the specific ordinary beauty of a thing that had been there before all of this and would be there long after. Indifferent and constant, and somehow, on a March afternoon with the last of the winter cold still in the air and the gulls working the wind overhead, exactly right. I know where the park is, she said. She ended the call. She stood in the parking lot for another minute alone, with the cold and the sound of the city going about its business and the distant lake, and she thought about the version of herself who had walked home from a double shift in a blizzard dreaming about sleep, who had stood at the edge of a decision with a trail of blood in the snow at her feet, who had chosen one thing instead of another in 30 seconds without fully knowing what she was choosing. She thought about what it had cost. She thought about what it had made. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked back into the hospital because there was work to do, and she was a person who did her work, and that had not changed. That had never changed. It was, she thought, the truest thing about her. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that was enough.